We want to go to the Pentagon now. Correspondent Courtney Kube. Courtney, what are you hearing from U.S. military sources about the size and nature of this attack?
So we're hearing so far that there were at least 3 separate barrages of incoming. But what remains unclear is exactly what it was. The original reports were that they were rockets, that the U.S. military there on this base were hunkered down. They were in bunkers for this original round, which was reported as 6 rockets. But then the incoming kept coming. There was another round that came through. That was when things became a little bit fuzzier, Lester, is exactly what it was that was coming in. You know, Richard mentioned the distance between al-Assad and Iran. The military there were saying that they believed that this was coming in from the direction of Iran. Was it actually from inside Iran or not? That would be the big difference here. Also, what would be a huge difference is whether, in fact, these were rockets or ballistic missiles, as there has been some reporting on media, specifically Iranian media, that these could be ballistic missiles. Now, there would be no mistaking for the individuals on the base if these were rockets, especially the kind of Katyusha rockets that we see in these attacks on installations there in Iraq, versus a ballistic missile. The damage would be significantly different there, Lester. So far, though, the U.S. military is still, they say they are trying to figure out exactly what happened. The military there are still locked down and hunkered down, and we're waiting to hear whether there was, what exactly may have been hit and whether there were any casualties, Lester.
And Courtney, this base, I believe, has been visited by President Trump in the past. Do you know what kind of security measures are in place? What sort of shelters are there?
Tremendous. I mean, it's a sprawling, enormous base out really in the middle of the desert in Iraq, west of Baghdad. This installation, as all of the ones around Iraq since the death of Qasem Soleimani, they have been at a heightened state of alert. But it is an enormous airfield. It's a place, as you mentioned, President Trump went there. One of the reasons that kind of base would be visited by a distinguished visitor, a VIP like President Trump, is that they have the ability to provide more security. It's not the area is not congested like the air bases down, like the base down in Baghdad, with a sprawling city around it. So they provides more protection. I mean, candidly, just being able to launch something into that base and target something would be more difficult because it is so spread out.
Courtney Kube at the Pentagon. Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here. And click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.